This Essentials lesson plan is the first tier of instruction in a series of EndNote classes that we offer monthly. We alternate operating systems each month, so feel free to keep an eye on our upcoming training calendar to register for the macOS counterpart to this lesson plan in December. Attendees should be able to demonstrate the minimal knowledge and skills required to use EndNote for importing, organizing, and citing references. Today we'll start with a quick outline of the differences between EndNote Desktop, the software you install on your hard drive, and EndNote Online, which is EndNote's cloud solution. There's some differences between the two environments, and I want to be sure that I point those out before we actually begin. We'll create an EndNote library, which consists of two separate components, and we'll sort of go over those two components, why it's important to keep those components together. And we'll also review a couple of critical points as to where you shouldn't store a library that you're actively developing. There are a couple of places where a library should not be saved if you're still in the process of adding references or making changes to that library. We'll go over the various customization options that you have available in EndNote 20 to personalize the appearance of your EndNote library. You've got some flexibility with regard to, which information you're displaying, on your reference panel, which can make it a lot easier to, find the critical references for the various projects that you're working on. We'll look at the various options that you have for reference creation. You've always got the ability to manually add a reference. We'll go over a quick example of how you can manually add an entry to your EndNote library. You have the ability to import references from a consistently tagged text file as well. If we have time, we'll actually put that through its paces, walk through the text file import process. At the very least, I'll show you what that text file would normally look like, the sort of the tagged format that EndNote requires to be able to make heads or tails of where one reference ends and the next reference begins. We'll use an online database. We'll actually be using PubMed as our example today to connect to a remote database via EndNote itself through a feature called online search, so that we can query that remote database, preview the search results, and then capture or export specific search results and add those to the local EndNote library that we'll be working with in today's class. We're going to look at how you can export both references and full text articles using a new component that's been integrated in EndNote 20 called EndNote Click. It's a Clarivate solution that had been formerly known as Copernio, and with EndNote 20, it's been integrated directly in the application and rebranded to be part of the EndNote suite. And so we'll look at how you can use this browser plugin to not only export a reference to your library, but at the same time capture the full text article, which traditionally had been a two-step process. So this can be a real great time saver. We'll look at how you can start, once you start adding references to your EndNote library, how you can add an extra level of organization to that EndNote library by placing your references in what we call group sets, which is sort of an overarching element within your library that you might create for various projects that you're working on or focus areas in your field of study. And once you've got a group set created, how you can utilize something called a custom group to associate specific references from your overall library with that particular project so that you can quickly look at that set of references at any point by just selecting that particular group. We'll shift gears a bit and talk about file attachments in EndNote. We'll walk through an example of manually adding a file to an EndNote library record. We'll look at how you can attach PDFs automatically to existing references in your EndNote library using a feature in EndNote called Find Full Text. Can be a real great time saver to have EndNote go out onto the web to download those articles for you automatically. We'll look at how you can import PDFs from your hard drive into your EndNote library. EndNote can import both standalone PDFs or a folder of PDFs. And today we're actually going to look at an example of importing a folder of PDFs so that EndNote, tries to capture the details for each one of those articles one at a time. We'll look at the the enhanced or revamped PDF previewer that's available in EndNote 20, and we'll walk through the various annotation options that you have available in EndNote so that you can add a little bit more context to the pages of the articles that you've attached to your library records. And these annotations are something that would synchronize between your own computers if you set up an EndNote feature called EndNote Sync, and would also synchronize between co-authors and collaborators if you were to set up the library sharing feature. We're not going to talk too much about sync or library sharing today, but I'll give a little bit additional context for those features and point out at the end of the session which webinar it is that we cover those topics. And we'll be hosting one of those webinars later this month. And then we'll round out with a quick overview of what we call the Cite While You Write plugin for Microsoft Word. It's essentially an add-on that EndNote loads into Microsoft Word if you're running a compatible version of Microsoft Office. And these tools are used to take references from your EndNote library, cite them within the body of text if you'd like, or within a footnote or an EndNote at the end of your document. And then depending on the output style that you select, EndNote will automatically format the appearance of your in-text citations and your formatted bibliography to make sure that you're in accordance with your formatting guidelines for whatever submission source you'll be submitting this project to. And we won't be going over the full feature set of Cite While You Write, but we will cover what I call the daily driver features that will allow you to, cite references a couple of different ways in a writing project, how you would, properly remove a citation if you might have cited one by mistake, or if the scope of your body of text changes as such where you no longer need a particular citation. And we'll also look at how you can customize the appearance of individual in-text citations, which is something certain output styles or formatting guidelines will call for under various scenarios. So with that said, I think we're ready to dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and just exit out of slideshow mode here in my PowerPoint presentation. And, when you install EndNote, Windows or Mac OS, EndNote doesn't make a shortcut on your desktop automatically. That's something you can create if you'd like once you install the software. But just like any other program on Windows, you can launch EndNote from your Start menu. If you're on Windows 10, you can use the integrated Cortana search field here on the taskbar. If you have Microsoft Office, there is, like I mentioned, the EndNote tab where you can press go to EndNote. So, quite a number of different ways you can launch the application. You can see I've already got EndNote running, just minimized right now. It's a tab on my taskbar. I'm going to click on it. And if you were a user of a previous version of EndNote, you'll see that the program window looks a little bit different. Traditionally, if you were in EndNote with a library, with no library open, you would see a gray background window. And again, it's something basically just to let you know that you're in EndNote. It's just that you don't have a library open. This is something that would confuse some users who might not have invested some time in a class like this. And so our developers wanted to tweak the approach of the appearance of that window. So here in EndNote 20, you do have a transitional program window that will disappear once you have a library open. On the program window itself, you have a shortcut to open an existing library if you might have already created a library yourself, or perhaps a colleague created a library and sent it to you, maybe via Dropbox or OneDrive. You have a shortcut to create a brand new library if you're looking to get started from scratch. But we also have the traditional items here on the File drop-down menu as well. So if you wanted to open a library, you can do so from the File menu. Today, we're just going to get started by creating a new blank library. So I'm going to go ahead and select New from the File drop-down menu to get started. And when you create an EndNote library, all EndNote needs you to identify or define is the location where you would like to create this EndNote library and the name you would like to assign this library. So when it comes to creating a library, I had mentioned there are a couple of places where you don't want to save a library that you're actively developing. Specifically, it would be network drives and local sync folders. If you save a library that you're actively developing to a network drive, that can increase your risk of encountering library corruption, and it can also cause general performance issues in the EndNote application, where a function that might typically take a split second to complete might take 10 seconds I've seen to complete if there's network latency issues, a slowness over the network. So again, if you're in the process of actively developing a library, make sure to save it somewhere on your local hard hard drive, in addition to what I had just mentioned about network drives, be sure that you're not saving active libraries to local sync folders. So that means in terms of local sync folders, a Dropbox folder would not be suitable for a library that you're actively developing. A folder being synced by OneDrive would be the same. These sync utilities, due to the order in which they synchronize files, will also lead to an increased risk of encountering library corruption. So again, to avoid that increased risk of encountering library corruption, save your library to any local folder that's not being synced by a third-party service. I know that my documents folder is not being synced by any other service, so I'm going to save my library here in Documents. We see that I've already got an EndNote folder that I've created just to help keep things organized. And if I navigate into that EndNote folder, we see a series of subfolders. I've created a libraries folder here just to, again, help keep my files organized on my drive. So this particular path is not required. This, if you were looking for a recommendation and your documents folder was not being synced, this would probably be my recommended path if you were, again, looking for a recommendation. EndNote suggests the name My EndNote Library, and that name is perfectly fine, but I usually recommend replacing that name with some other name that's a little bit more pertinent to your research or just your usage of EndNote. Now, it is your choice. If you'd like to create separate libraries for different projects or focus areas in your field of study, you're free to do so. We do recommend storing all of your research materials in a single EndNote library to help streamline some various aspects of EndNote's usage or function. EndNote, let's say maybe you were working on 5 separate projects and you made 5 separate libraries, one library for each project. If there was some overlap between the contents of those libraries and you were looking for a particular reference that you captured at some point, in that scenario, you might have to perform that search up to 5 times, once per library, to locate that particular reference. EndNote can't search across multiple libraries when looking for a reference. So again, if you were to use the approach of storing all of your research materials in a single EndNote library, having everything in one library would mean that one simple search would locate any particular reference that might exist in EndNote. And in addition to that, EndNote's duplicate search can't scan across multiple libraries when determining duplicates. So if you store all of your materials in a single library, EndNote would have a better chance at spotting duplicates and highlighting those for you so you can take them out and keep your library organized and clear of duplicate references. Those features that I mentioned, EndNote sync and library sharing, those features are really designed around the concept or the approach of your EndNote usage of storing everything in a single library. So for EndNote sync and library sharing, you do have to pick one primary library that you're syncing with EndNote online and that you're possibly sharing with up to 100 other EndNote users. So I did want to point that out. Again, we're not really going to delve too deep in syncing or sharing today, but I will point out the lesson the webinar that we cover those particular topics. So again, I've got my location saved to this subfolder in Documents. I'm giving this library the name My Research Projects, and I'm going to go and just press Save to finish this library creation process. Once I've saved that library, we see that the white background window has disappeared. It has now been replaced with my library window. A difference in EndNote 20 is that if you do work with separate libraries, each library will exist as a separate program window, which makes it a little bit easier if you're multitasking or working between different projects. With previous versions of EndNote, all libraries would open in the same program window. They could overlap each other, and it would be a little bit confusing if you were working between separate libraries. It was doable, but you would have to use the window drop-down menu to cycle between the various libraries windows. So again, that's a difference here. So I'm going to go ahead. This isn't a requirement, but I want to maximize my library window just to better use my screen real estate. I'm basically dedicating the entire screen to EndNote. Now, before we dive into an overview of the library window, I did want to mention that there is a sort of a freemium model to EndNote. EndNote Desktop, and we're currently on EndNote 20, just came out last week, is paid software that you would either purchase a license for yourself, or if you're affiliated with a school, or maybe your employer purchases a Cite license, there's a chance that your school or your work may provide a copy of EndNote Desktop for you to use. But again, if you're not affiliated with a school or an employer that has a Cite license, that's something you can always purchase a standalone license yourself. If you weren't a desktop user, if you maybe weren't looking to buy a license, or you weren't getting a copy from school or work, like I mentioned, you can make what's called a free EndNote basic account, which is sort of like I was mentioning, the freemium level of account that you can create in EndNote Online. A couple of ways you can get to EndNote Online. We're not going to talk too much about the online interface today, but I just wanted to point out the differences between the online interface and the desktop interface. I'm here in Mozilla Firefox. I've just navigated to endnote.com. You can see right on the EndNote homepage, we've got a link at the top to access the EndNote Online login page. I could click there. I could also navigate directly to just myendnoteweb.com. If I were to input this URL and press return, it would take me to a little bit of a longer address, but sort of why we recommend just using this. It's a little bit easier to remember this URL versus the actual login URL. So again, if you visit myendnoteweb.com, you'll be taken to this page here. If you did not have an account yet, you can create, like I mentioned, a free EndNote basic account that can get a pretty standard research paper done. You would have the ability with EndNote Basic to store up to 50,000 references and up to 2 gigabytes worth of file attachments, and you've got access to about 24 different output styles. Again, you can get a pretty basic paper done. I've already got an account, so I'm just going to log into it here quickly. I just want to show you what the web interface looks like. And once you're logged in, you'll have access to what we would call your EndNote Online library. Here it is. And if I hide the Getting Started guide, you can see that I've already got 10 references in my web library here. I've got a group that I've created for a class project, and another EndNote Online user has shared a group with me. So again, this is the web interface. If you don't have access to EndNote Desktop, you can make a free EndNote Basic account, get a pretty basic research paper done. But there are over 30 power features that are available only in EndNote Desktop. And so really the desktop software is going to give you much more functionality and flexibility with regard to how you're working with your references. When you've got access to the desktop software, you can still make a free EndNote Online account, and you would actually have an enhanced experience. You wouldn't have the 50,000 reference limit or the 2 gigabyte file attachment limit. You would be able to store basically less than 1 million references in your EndNote library, and you would have really unlimited storage space for file attachments for your 2 years of account enhancement that you gain just by linking your EndNote Online account with your desktop license. So really, that's as far as we're going to talk about EndNote Online today. We're focusing on EndNote Desktop, but I did just want to sort of point out the differences between the desktop software and the online interface. And the other classes in this series, like I mentioned, cover some of the functionality related to EndNote Online with regard to EndNote sync and library sharing. Those features really work in tandem with your EndNote Online account. And so again, we go over some of the online interface and functionality a little bit deeper in the advanced and expert level classes for EndNote. I'm going to go and just minimize my browser again and return to EndNote Desktop, where we've got a library open. Now, to help me better illustrate the various panels that comprise the library window, I actually want to open the sample library that installs within EndNote. So if you're following along and you've just created a new blank library, feel free to just leave that open. You don't have to go and open the sample library as well. But because this sample library already has some groups, references, and file attachments in it, it just helps me better illustrate the various panels that we're seeing here. I'm going to leave this library open, at least for the moment, and I'm going to open an additional library by clicking the File drop-down menu here in EndNote. We see we've got the Open Library menu item. I'll choose that. Now, before we move on to find the sample library, I just want to point out the components that comprise an EndNote library. So we see that I've been taken back to that same folder where I just created this new library, and we see two components. There's a file that has the name of the library, my research projects, but with a .enl extension, and we see a folder in the same location that has the same name as the library, but it has a .data extension. And you could think of the analogy that the ENL file is the door to the warehouse. This is the file that you would interact with if you were looking to open this library. But the data folder is really the warehouse where all of the library information is stored. And it is really critical that you keep these two components together. If you were to move or delete your data folder, EndNote would try to make a fresh copy of it, but you would be missing your groups, you would be missing file attachments, and there's a chance that you could even be missing recently entered references. So again, it's really imperative that you keep these two items together. So if you're ever looking to move your library from one location to another on your drive, make sure to include both components. If you're manually backing up the library, make sure that you copy both of these components. And if you're just cleaning up your hard drive, just be aware of how important this data folder is, and be sure that you're not deleting it by mistake just to clean up the drive. That's a situation, again, from my days in EndNote product support. Users who might not have invested some time in a class like this would not be aware of how important that data folder is, and I've seen users accidentally delete this without realizing the importance of the folder. So to find the sample library that installs with EndNote 20 on Windows, I'm going to go to my C drive. Here I've got my Program Files x86 folder. This is where EndNote installs on Windows. We see I have my EndNote 20 folder. I'm going to open that. And then I have a shortcut to examples. You see it's not alphabetical here. It's actually a shortcut. That's why it's listed after the folders to another folder called examples. If I double click on this, I'm taken to a different path under the public documents folder. And this is an important location for these sample items or sample files on Windows, because if you're using EndNote on a shared workstation, maybe not so much these days, but if things get back to normal and we're back in, lab settings or library settings, and you have workstations where multiple users might access the same computer, this is a location where everyone on the workstation would be able to access EndNote sample resources and be able to, learn about EndNote and use these sample files to, get started, feel comfortable before they actually go create their own library. We see that we have one library file in here called sample library 20.enlx. This is a different structure than what we just reviewed for the library called My Research Projects. This is, as the type indicates, is an archived EndNote library. It's a compressed file. If you're familiar with a zip file, it's basically that same concept. It's the type of file that can actually contain more than one item. And this compressed archived library contains this library's ENL file and data folder. So this compressed format that you can create in EndNote is really handy for backup purposes, because instead of having to maintain those two separate items, it's just one file that you would need to keep track of. And if you were looking to email your library from one computer to another, you really need to compress it like this before you attach the library to an email, because most email clients won't allow you to attach a folder as an email attachment, and so otherwise your library's data folder couldn't be attached as an email attachment. So I just wanted to point that out. If I were to double click this library, EndNote would extract the ENL file and data folder and show me the library on the screen, or I can just single click like I've got now, and I can press open. Either way, I'm going to go and just press open. All right, so EndNote's extracting that sample library, and just to point out again, I've got two libraries open currently. We see that they're both separate tabs for the EndNote program here on my taskbar. Just to keep things organized, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my empty library that I created at the start of our lesson, and I'm going to close this now. I could either click the X in the top corner, or I can go to the File menu and choose Close Library. Either way, I think I'll go ahead and use the menu item. Perfect. We're back on the sample library here. So the library is comprised of three primary panels. The middle of the library is a panel that we call the reference panel. Each one of these lines represents a separate reference that's stored in this library. In some cases, you might hear the term library record used interchangeably with library reference. So if you're reading through an EndNote knowledge article from the EndNote support page, or you're working with the product support support team. Again, you might hear the terminology of record and reference used interchangeably, but really each term just indicates one particular entry in your library. We see that as I'm clicking through here on the reference panel, we see that the tabs panel is updating here on the right to show some underlying details for this particular reference. And I did want to mention, I'm not sure if anyone on the session is a user of a previous version of EndNote, but our product team, the EndNote product team, conducted extensive focus group testing with both longtime EndNote users and new EndNote users, and actually even non-users, to get their opinion on the design changes that we're looking to be implemented here in EndNote 20. And so all of these design decisions were informed by user input, and the feedback is overwhelmingly positive for these changes. And with the changes that we've introduced to the library here, primarily with the tabs panel, we're able to display more vital information front and center than we've ever been able to in the past. So you can see here we've got the summary tab, and again, we've got sort of the primary details for the specific type of reference that we're previewing. We see all of the pertinent details listed here. If an abstract is available, we've got the abstract shown as well. If you're a Web of Science user and you're IP authenticated currently, so that EndNote and Web of Science can recognize you're a valid or an authenticated user of Web of Science, there are some links to access the source record back in Web of Science here at the bottom of the summary tab. We've also got a link to access related records in the Web of Science, and that would be other references indexed by the Web of Science in which the references have at least one citation in common with the particular reference that we're previewing right now. So you can really expand your your Web of Science usage, or maximize your Web of Science usage with these shortcuts that are added here in EndNote. With previous versions of EndNote, you could double-click on one of the entries here on the reference panel, and you would get a separate pop-up window that would sort of overlay in front of your library window. Again, in some scenarios can make it a little bit tricky cycling between the various windows. So now if you were looking to either just view the underlying information for a particular reference or edit the reference further, you see here on the tabs panel we have a tab called Edit, where again you can just read the underlying information if you'd like, but you can also add information if you wanted to here. You could delete information, you could fix a typo. Really, any change that you would have been able to make in an EndNote library record historically, you're able to do here. This functionality is just integrated directly on the library window itself, so it really can help streamline your usage for the EndNote application. We see that items that have at least one file attachment show a little paperclip here in the reference panel, and we see right here on the summary tab, we see a shortcut to that particular attachment. So this reference has one PDF article linked to it. We're going to look at the PDF previewer in just a little bit, so I'm not going to open this PDF just yet, but I just want to point out that you'll be able to view all of your attachments, whether they're PDFs or other types of files like Word documents or Excel spreadsheets. You'll be able to view them and open them directly from the summary tab here. Now, before we move on to the groups panel here on the left, I did just want to point out that on the reference tab, the reference panel, you've got up to 10 display columns. And these are the default display columns. If I wanted to reorder the columns that I'm showing here, I can drag and drop a column label from one position to another, and again you can just see that it repositions as soon as I drop. If I hover my mouse over the display column labels, I see a little gear shortcut here, and if I click on that, that takes me right to the display fields tab here on the EndNote preferences window. So this I could get to as well from the edit dropdown, but if I click on that little gear icon, I'm taken right to display fields where I see my 10 display columns, and if I wanted to, I can hide existing columns, or I could, one of the undisplayed columns that are set not to display here, I can maybe display a bit of information. Maybe I plan to add some information to the label field, I could show that. Maybe the DOI is important and I want to be able to see that right on the reference panel. I can choose to show that as well. I think I'm going to go and just show label for now here. So I'll just select that from the drop-down. There we go. I'll press OK. So you've got really a lot of control over how the library window appears and how the information is displayed. Now, just to round out the overall overview of the library window, we've got the groups panel here on the left, where we've got default groups that always exist, such as all references, recently added, unfiled, and trash. Those groups always exist in an EndNote library, but if you want to store, separate sets of references for different projects or different topics in the same library, that's where you can make what we call group sets, which are these overarching labels that we see here for even intelligence, BATS. There's a default My Groups group set listed as well. Under these group sets, we see examples of the 3 types of groups that you can create in EndNote. We're only going to be talking about custom groups today. Smart groups and combination groups we discuss in the advanced lesson plan, but we see some examples here of what we call custom groups, which are groups that you would manually populate, like this parents group here. This is a custom group. We see smart groups represented by the little magnifying glass icon. A smart group is the type of group that EndNote automatically populates based off of a search that you craft when you create that smart group. And we also see, and again, we're not going to go too in depth today, but we see an example, a couple examples of what we call combination groups that EndNote automatically populates when you're looking to compare or contrast the contents of 2 or more groups. So all of these elements can be really handy to organize, references for different projects and be able to store everything in a single library and quickly be able to look at any set of references at any given time. But today we're going to be focusing on custom groups and group sets. If you wanted to, this is a change added to EndNote 20, but if you wanted to minimize all of your groups for whatever reason, you can do so by toggling the little caret symbol or the arrow symbol next to My Groups. Perhaps you were performing a find full text search or an online search and you wanted to be able to find those results a little bit easier. That might be an example when you might want to minimize your groups temporarily, just to make it a little bit easier to find these elements in the groups panel. Now, before we move on, I did want to point out as well for anyone who might be a previous user of EndNote, you can no longer reposition the tabs panel here on the right. If you want to, you can hide it at any point by clicking the little X in the corner of the panel. That would dedicate a little bit more screen real estate to your reference panel. But prior versions of EndNote, you used to be able to move the tabs panel to the bottom. But really these days, with widescreen monitors being the standard, really the best use of your screen real estate is having this information here on the right. And with old versions of EndNote, you used to be able to completely hide the groups panel. Now that functionality no longer exists in EndNote 20. I would say I've never really suggested hiding the groups panel. It's even if you're not using custom groups and group sets of your own, I think it's pretty imperative to be able to see the default groups that exist in your library. So I think it was a pertinent change to really just simplify your approach to using EndNote, make sure that things don't go missing for those who might not be aware of those elements. So that was a quick overview of the library window itself, the changes that exist in EndNote 20. I guess the one last element that I did want to touch on here in the tabs panel is what we call the preview panel here at the bottom, where you'll be previewing whichever reference is selected here in your references panel. You would be able to see how it looks with a specific output style. Right now, we've got the default annotated style selected, which is a generic author date style that includes abstract information, as you see here. If I wanted to change the style, I could choose another favorite that's listed right here on this short list. So for example, I've just changed to the Vancouver style. We see the preview update dynamically. And if I wanted to preview a style that's not marked as a favorite, I could choose select another style, where you'll find about the default list of styles that get installed with EndNote 20, about 500 of our most popular styles. We've just got over 7,000 styles available to download at endnote.com. So if there's a particular style that you're looking for that you can't find on this default list, check the downloads page at endnote.com. There's a good chance that style exists in our online style repository. And if you or unable to find a particular set of formatting guidelines that you need, as long as you know how you want your references to appear, feel free to reach out to our EndNote product support team, and our product support representatives would be happy to help guide you through editing an existing style to get it to match the requirements that you're looking for. The only requirement from the product support side is that you just need to know how you want to output your references so that you would be able to guide the agent through making the required changes. So I did want to point that out. Quickly here, I'll go ahead and just type a couple of letters to jump to another style on the list. I'm going to go ahead and just select the JAMA style by highlighting it and pressing choose. And again, we see that the preview updates dynamically here. So with that overview out of the way, I think we're ready to start adding references to this library. And you know, I wanted to cover quickly the method of manual reference creation first. This is probably something that you'll do seldomly. In most cases, for most reference types, you'll be able to find your reference materials in a database that has an EndNote export option so that you'll be able to just export specific search results to your library. That's something we're going to look at in just a moment. But, you know, for maybe if you want to cite a standalone web page, let's say, typically a standalone website doesn't have an EndNote export option. That's something you need to manually add to your library. Or in some cases, maybe, you know, government reports. You may be able to find the report electronically on the web, but there's a good chance that that, you know, specific government agency doesn't have an EndNote export option for their reports. So that might be another scenario where you need to manually add something to your library. So at any point, if you needed to manually add a reference to your library, here on the References drop-down menu, you've got the button for New Reference. You also see a keyboard shortcut for it here as well. But if I click on New Reference, I'm taken to the New Reference screen. And the first thing I would recommend doing is setting the appropriate reference type. And I recommend doing that first because some of the field labels will update to show labels that are more appropriate for that type of reference. So just as an example, the default reference type is journal article. That's something you can change if you'd like, but I'd say for most users, journal articles are probably the most common type of research materials. But if I were to, let's say, add a newspaper article to my library and I choose that reference type, keep an eye on the field labels that appear to the left of this drop-down. And you'll see that when I click newspaper article, some of these labels update. So what had been called the author field is now labeled reporter, a little bit more appropriate for this type of reference. What had been the journal field for a journal article reference is now the newspaper field, again, a little bit more appropriate for this type of reference. You don't have to fill in every single field here. You would just input as much information as you've got. At the very least, you would want to populate the fields that you would want to include within your formatted reference list. When you're entering names, whether they be author names or editor names in EndNote, you can use either last name, comma, first name, or first name space last name. That's how EndNote is sort of able to make heads or tails of, you know, what's the person's first name or what's the person's surname. You want to make sure that you enter each name on its own line within any author field. That's how EndNote tells where one name ends and the next name begins. Now, these two names are showing in red, and that doesn't mean that there's a problem per se. Red, this sort of red text will appear in fields that are linked to a term list, where EndNote is sort of indexing the terms that get entered in that field. And for this author field, even though it's called reporter, it's basically linked to the author term list. EndNote is just telling me that this is the first time these names appear in this library. So red doesn't mean wrong. Red just is letting me know that this is the first time the name appears. If I knew I had another reference from one of these authors, that would be an indicator to me to let me know maybe I've got a typo, or maybe I'm using a different naming convention, which could throw off EndNote's ability to consistently output a person's name in a formatted bibliography. So I did want to point that out. This is all I'm going to fill in today. Again, I can always come back and add further information here, but this is enough just for a basic reference to add to my library. Once I'm done, I can go to the top right of this window. I can press the Save button here. As soon as that gets saved, I can then close this standalone reference window. I'm just going to click the X in the top corner. I'll be taken back to my library window here, and we see that it is now, an unfiled reference, because these 2 references currently don't exist or not associated with at least one custom group here. So you can almost think of the unfiled group as your library's inbox. And if you are looking to make sure that each of your references are organized in a particular group for a particular project, the unfiled group is a way to let you know if you've missed any. And as soon as we start talking about custom groups in a bit, I am going to file these 2 references away. But that was a quick overview of how you can manually add a reference to your library. Might not be something you need to do very often, but that was just a real basic overview of how you would be able to do so. And again, you don't have to populate every field. At minimum, you would want to populate the fields that you would be outputting in a formatted bibliography. The next method of reference creation I wanted to touch on is called online search. It's a feature that's built into EndNote, which allows EndNote to connect to remote databases, to query for research materials to add to your library. And again, for users of older versions of EndNote, there's a change related to online search functions in EndNote 20. It's really been streamlined. In older versions of EndNote, there were what were called display modes. And depending on which display mode you were on, the online search feature would function a little different. One display mode would just automatically capture your results. Another display mode would let you pick and choose which ones you wanted. And they were displayed on different interfaces, essentially. In EndNote 20, this is all integrated right on the primary library window. So we see at the bottom of my groups panel here, I've got a section called Online Search. These are connection files that have been marked as favorites by default here. If I wanted to establish a connection, I could click on any one of these favorited connection files, and that would initiate the remote search of the database. If I wanted to look at my complete list of connection files, I can click on More here, where again, I've got several hundred connection files that get installed with EndNote by default. We have additional connection files available to download at endnote.com/download. So if there's a particular database you were looking for that wasn't on this list, feel free to check the online connection file repository, and there's a good chance that that database might be listed and available to download. Now, these remote databases do need to support a particular database protocol called Z39.50. If the remote database doesn't support this protocol, EndNote can't establish a connection. So I only mention that because EndNote can't connect to every database that you can query from a web browser. For instance, if you are a fan of Google Scholar and you capture, references from there, that's a great resource, but they don't support the Z39.50 protocol, which means that you can't search Google Scholar from online search. So I just wanted to point that out. A lot of these entries labeled as library catalogs are free to search. These are digitized card catalogs at schools around the world. Some of them can be locked down behind a username and password so that only students and faculty affiliated with that school would be able to access the resource, but the majority of these library catalogs are free to search. There are nationally and federally funded databases listed here as well that are typically free to search. For instance, we've got a connection file for the Library of Congress. This is a federally funded database federally funded database here that's in the United States. This is really the quintessential books database. If you're looking for a book reference, there's a good chance you'll be able to find it here in Library of Congress. Today, we're going to use the PubMed database at the National Library of Medicine as our example, so I've just highlighted it here on the list. Before I establish the connection, I did want to point out that there are some subscription-based connection files here as well. For instance, anything labeled as ProQuest or OvidSP, you would have to have a subscription with that information provider. And in addition to that, you would have to have a username and password assigned by the information provider. So if you have access to one of these databases through your university, let's say, that type of subscription might not be set up as such where every university student, let's say, has a different username and password, which means that you wouldn't, in that scenario, you wouldn't be able to search the database through EndNote, but you would still typically be able to search the database from your library's website and then do something what we call direct export results to your library. And that's what we're going to look at right after online search. But just to show you how you can search from EndNote 20 here, again, I'm going to highlight PubMed NLM. I could double click on the entry to establish the connection, or I can just single click and press choose. Either way, I'll go ahead and press choose. Perfect. So again, we're still on this integrated display. Right now, all of my existing references are temporarily hidden. I'm on again, a sort of a temporary search space to query the PubMed database at the National Library of Medicine. We see that the search panel here that if I wasn't connected to a remote database would be used to query my local library. Since I've established a connection to the remote database, I've now the search panel has been reconfigured to query that database. So the list of fields that I have available to search by, these are dictated by the database administrator. EndNote has no control over which fields you would query a remote database for. I did want to point that out. And the list of fields can vary from database to database. For instance, if I was searching Library of Congress instead, PMID would not be an option because that's a unique PubMed identifier that Library of Congress doesn't index. So I did want to point that out. Today I'm going to do a real quick search of the PubMed database for a real simple search of title contains sushi. I'm going to be preparing, gathering references for a writing project pertaining to sushi, the food. And so today I'm going to be casting a couple of wide nets, doing some broad searches for the term sushi, and just getting some materials in my library that I'll be able to review and then, whittle down further as I, examine my search results. So I could do a multi-parameter search if I wanted to. This is fine for a first example. I'm going to go ahead and initiate my search by pressing search. And a change here in EndNote 20 is that EndNote will automatically download the first 25 search results. If you want additional results, you have the option to download 50, 75, or 100. Or if you want the complete range, you've got the top most number, and you can click on that, and that would, again, download the complete range. I'm going to go ahead and download all 170. This should come in pretty quickly. Again, none of these references are in my library just yet. They're in this temporary space where I can review these results and then decide which I'd like to keep. So it looks like I've just finished gathering all 170 search results. We're showing those here. I can start clicking on these references. I can start reviewing the underlying information. A lot of these references coming from PubMed will have abstracts that I would be able to review as well. And as I'm deciding the references I want to capture, I just need to highlight them. So you can see that, as I'm clicking around and selecting references, they become marked automatically. You can do this one at a time. You can highlight a batch of references and copy them all at once. If you might want to capture all of the search results, you could do that quickly by just checking the little column label for the checkbox, and you see that I've just marked all 170 search results at the same time. As soon as I'm ready to capture these references and add them to my local library, I would just click this little plus symbol button. This is the indicator to EndNote that I want to take the highlighted references and add them to my local library. I'm going to click this just once. All right, so we see that my all references count has grown, my recently added count has grown, my unfiled count has grown. Again, these are considered unfiled references until they're in at least one custom group. And before we move on, I am going to file these references away in a group for this particular project. Again, it's personal preference, but I like to treat my library's unfiled group as its inbox. And I try to keep the count down to 0 as much as possible, because if I do that, it makes grouping the references much easier. So I'm going to make a group set for this sushi project, and then I'm going to make a custom group for this project that's going to serve as a catch-all for everything I gather in my library for this particular writing project. So to make my group set, I'm going to go to my Groups drop-down menu. About halfway down, I have Create Group Set. I'll click on that. I've got my new group set on the left. Its name is highlighted. I could just backspace to delete that placeholder name. Any naming convention is fine, but something related to the project usually makes the most sense. Since this writing project will be on the topic of sushi, I'm going to call the group set Sushi. Now that the group set is created, it's ready to start receiving groups for different purposes related to this project. Again, we've got custom groups, combination groups, and smart groups available to us. Today, we're really just going to be focusing on custom groups, and that's the type of group that you manually populate. So for me, again, I'm going to be casting some wide nets for this topic, just so that I make sure that I'm able to review all of the pertinent research for this project, and then whittle that down and decide which references might be suitable for my writing project. So with my sushi group set selected, I'm going to make my custom group called Sushi in General that will serve as a catch-all for all of this research. So with my group set selected, I'll go back to the groups drop-down. I'll click on, I'll click at the first menu item. It's called Create Group. That's going to make my custom group. All right, we see my new group here, placeholder name, new group. I'm going to backspace that to take that placeholder name out. Any naming convention is fine, but something related to the purpose of the group usually makes the most sense. This is going to be a catch-all group for me. I'm going to call it Sushi in General. Press Enter to set the name. All right, we see my new custom group with a little custom group icon, signifying that this is the type of group that I manually populate. And all I need to do now is select my unfiled references, and a couple of ways I can associate them, but the simplest is dragging and dropping them over that group. So I'm on Unfiled. I need to highlight all of these references. To do that, I'm just going to select any one of these references to make the reference panel active. Now I can go to the Edit drop-down and choose Select All. That highlights all currently 172 references. And if I wanted to, I could just drag and drop right over my custom group. Or I could go to the Groups drop-down. I've got Add References To. And on the submenu, I can click on the group to make that association. This time, I'm going to go and just do the menu item. I'm going to click on Sushi in General here. Right away, we see that I've got all 172 references here in Sushi in General, and we see that currently nothing is considered unfiled because all 361 references currently have are associated with at least one custom group. And again, that's not a requirement to your EndNote usage, but if you do want to group your references, filing them away as you add them to your library makes the process a lot easier. So that's online search. It's really nice to be able to search a remote database through EndNote, but again, the database has to support that Z39.50 protocol, and the search itself is very literal. For instance, I just wanted to give an example. If I queried PubMed through EndNote for the phrase heart attack, I get over, I think it's just about 10,000 search results, where if I perform that same search from the PubMed website, the website expands the scope of my search and will include references that contain the phrase myocardial infarction, since that's related to heart attack. So again, it's nice to be able to search through EndNote, but you might actually have a sort of a more in-depth or more advanced search experience querying an information provider's website and direct exporting references to your library. That's what we're going to do next. I'm going to leave my library open here. I've already got my Mozilla Firefox browser open as well, where I've navigated to the Web of Science database. This is going to be our first example of direct export. Time considering, I'm going to try to do 2 exports because the steps can vary from site to site, and I just want to reinforce that notion by exporting from 2 different information providers. But here in classic Web of Science, I'm going to perform a similar search to what I did in EndNote for that topic of sushi. We see that the default field selection here in Web of Science is topic, and we actually see that that's going to query several fields at once: title, abstract, author keywords, and keywords plus. So here in the parameter field, I'm going to input sushi. I'm going to perform a little bit more of a complex search here by pressing Add Row to add a second search parameter. I've got my Boolean operators. This is something you might have noticed in EndNote. They're not unique to EndNote or Web of Science. Any program, database, or website that can perform a multi-parameter search will have something like this to instruct the service to know how to link 2 or more search parameters together. Depending on whether you want to narrow or expand the scope of your search would dictate which operator you select. I want to narrow the scope of my results to only research published in the last decade. So for my second field selection, I'll choose year published, and in the second parameter field, I'm just going to define 2010 to present, 2020. If I press search, Web of Science comes back pretty much right away to let me know that in the Web of Science core collection, 678 references are indexed. From Web of Science, I can export up to 500 references at a time. That limit can vary from site to site, but Web of Science, I could do 500 at a time. If I just wanted specific references, I would just check them right on this results page, and only those items would be sent to my library. But if I don't mark anything, I'm going to go ahead and press export. We've got quite a few different destinations for this data. but because we're focusing on EndNote Desktop today, I'm going to go ahead and choose EndNote Desktop. And because I hadn't marked any of the references, this is where I can define the range that I would like to export. And I did just want to point out that in this example of the 678 results, I wouldn't be restricted from capturing the additional 178. It just means that I would have to do a batch of 500, and then I would come back here, and even though there's only 178 left, I could just say another 500, and it would encompass those 178. I'm just going to stick with 50 today. I think the first 50 would be, simple enough for this example. Now, certain information providers give you some control over how much data gets sent to EndNote, and because I'm searched the Web of Science core collection, I can request the author, title, source, and abstract, but if I select full record, I can get the author's address and the keywords for each reference, so a little bit more of a fleshed out record in my EndNote library. Now that I've got this configured, I can press export. Now what happens is that the information provider gathers the reference information and adds it to a temporary text file that needs to be opened by EndNote. And I just want to show you quickly, I've got an example of this CIW file that Web of Science creates. This is from a different search, but really the file that we saw Firefox prompt us to open looks something like this. Each reference would have each piece of data on its own line with an identifying tag in front of it. When you're importing data into EndNote, EndNote's not really reading the reference information. It's looking for these tags. And depending on the filter that is applied to the import, EndNote would know where that associated information should end up in your library. So I did just want to point out how that works behind the scenes. When you're direct exporting, the process can vary a little bit from browser to browser. I typically recommend Mozilla Firefox because it's got built-in file type associations on both macOS and Windows. So instead of relying on Windows or macOS to know how to handle a file, right in Firefox you can tell the browser to open the file with EndNote. If EndNote was not already selected, you might have to choose other and browse to it here if you needed to, but you just want to make sure it's set to open with EndNote. You might check to do this automatically so that you don't have to reconfigure this each time, but because I teach these classes fairly often, I want to go ahead and make sure that this prompt comes up next time. Now that I've got this configured, if I press OK, because I've got my library open already, EndNote knows where to add this information. EndNote's received the details. We see I have a new temporary group called Import references, and we see all 50 references from my search have been added here. They're also considered unfiled, like I mentioned, because they're not yet part of a custom group. If I click on any one of these records and then perform a select all shortcut, Control-A, I could now, if I want to this time, just drag and drop right over my custom group, let go. All right, we see all currently 222 references that I've found for this project are associated with this custom group that's serving as sort of a catch-all for this particular project. So that was an example of direct export. Due to time constraints, I really want to try to finish on time. I'm going to go ahead and, for now, skip the PubMed export. If we do have time later, I will circle back around to show you how the steps can vary. But just to highlight again, the process to direct export can vary from site to site. You can always reach out if you're affiliated with a university, reach out to your library. Typically, they would be familiar with EndNote, know the information provider's export options, and be able to guide you through the process. You can also reach out to EndNote product support as well. Our product support representatives would be happy to help identify how you would export from a particular information provider. But also, you could just come to a Google search page, and if you search for the name of an information provider and the phrase EndNote export, you'll usually find instructions prepared either by the information provider themselves or by a university, typically somewhere around the world. And even if it's instructions from a different school than yours, as long as you have access to the information provider's databases, typically the export instructions are the same. So again, you typically can find the export details from a simple Google search if it wasn't clear how to do so. So I wanted to point that out quickly here. All right, and so the last method that I wanted to quickly cover today was how you can capture a reference in terms of populating your library with reference research materials, was the feature that's been implemented or integrated in EndNote 20 called EndNote Click. It's a browser plugin. It gets installed automatically for Mozilla Firefox or Google Chrome, but really any Chromium-based browser, which means I believe Microsoft Edge now is a Chromium-based browser, so the plugin would work work there as well. This is something, like I mentioned, that gets installed automatically with EndNote 20. If your browser seems to be missing the plugin after you install EndNote, from the Tools drop-down here in EndNote 20, you could click the link to install the EndNote Click browser extension. That'll walk you through the process. I've already got it installed here in Mozilla Firefox. We see a shortcut to my my browser plugin here in the top right, where we've got EndNote Click. Now, I'm actually going to be teaching a 30-minute class tomorrow morning focusing solely on EndNote Click. There are a couple of different workflows that you can utilize this browser plugin to help jumpstart, your discovery process. Today, again, due to time constraint, I'm going to focus on exporting PDF from what's called your locker. So you'll see that, once you've got the browser plugin installed, you'll make a free account essentially, and that will designate a locker space for you where you can add, through your web searches, you can identify PDFs that you want to capture in your locker. Once you're in your EndNote Click locker, you'll see, thumbnails for each of your articles. I've got 2 currently. If I click on any one of these previews, I see the full PDF. I could preview it here if I wanted to, directly from this locker screen. But what I'm looking to do today is actually export not only the reference itself, but the PDF at the same time to my EndNote library. So we see here on the right panel, I've got an option to export the reference. I'll click on that. And again, similarly to Web of Science, what EndNote Click is doing is preparing a temporary text file that needs to be opened with EndNote. So Firefox is saying, I've been given an RIS file, again, which is basically just a text file. What do you want me to do with this? And I want to open it with EndNote to complete the export. If I go ahead and press OK, again, because my library is already open, EndNote comes to the front of the screen. I've got a new reference showing an imported references. All previous 50 are still there. It's just this temporary group is updated to show me what just came in so that I can make sure that it came in correctly. We see that we've got my new entry in my library, which is the PDF that we were reviewing in my locker, and we see that EndNote attached the PDF at the same time. So this is technically an enhancement, an EndNote enhancement that any information provider could take advantage of to export both the reference and the PDF at the same time. But as of right now, only what had been known as Copernio, now known as EndNote Click, takes advantage of this functionality. So again, instead of 2 separate workflows, you can actually perform both steps at once using the EndNote Click browser plugin. Really can help jumpstart the building of your library, save you a lot of time. And again, at the end of the session today, I'm going to pull up our live training calendar. I'll point out the class that I'll be hosting tomorrow, specifically on this topic, a 30-minute class that covers, creating an account, all of the bells and whistles that are part of this new feature in EndNote. To talk a little bit about the PDF previewing and annotating, now that we have a PDF, in my library here, we see that in the summary tab, I've got a little shortcut to the PDF, and if I click its little drop down, I can choose to open the file here. That's going to open it in EndNote with the PDF viewer panel. If I want to make this full screen, I can go and resize the window. If I want to better use my screen real estate even further, I can, increase the overall display of the actual article itself. I've got it at 200% now. And again, I can read the article from the screen, or if I click this little icon on the toolbar, I can access the annotation functionality here in EndNote. And I've got options to do things like highlight text if I wanted to. I'll highlight the title there. I can underline text. I can strike out text if I want. I can click this little speech bubble here to add what's called the sticky note to my page. And if I click on the page, I've got a little speech bubble. If I click on that, I've got the ability to add a note to myself or a colleague. Like I mentioned, if I set up library sharing, all of these annotations would synchronize between all library sharees. It really increase your level of collaboration. And I did want to mention this text is searchable after the fact. So once I've added a sticky note, if I close it, and then I'm done with the article itself here, I can close this window, EndNote prompt me to save my change. If I say yes, I'm back on my library window. And, right now what we have at the top of this library window is this simple search, which is almost like a wildcard. It's a quick search of any field. But if I click on advanced search, that toggles the search panel. So again, I can toggle quickly between simple search and online search at any point when I'm searching my library. But if I want to search for sticky note text, on the fields drop-down, I would either choose PDF notes or any field plus PDF with notes. Either of those would include sticky note text. Let's just choose PDF notes. And if I search for that phrase that I had typed in there, sort of that generic phrase, interesting article, and press search, it's hard to tell I was already displaying that reference, but we see that this is the search result that came up here. And EndNote's just letting me know that the attachment here has that phrase in it. So really, really nice to be able to preview PDFs in EndNote and annotate those resources right in your library. Now, EndNote with EndNote, you can attach up to 45 files per library record, and really any type of file can be linked to an EndNote library record. It's only PDFs that you can preview and annotate directly in EndNote. So if this new item that I've just highlighted, if I want to link something to it, on the Summary tab, I can click Attach File. I get a browse window where I can choose a file on my drive. Maybe this time I'll attach a Word document instead. I can highlight that, press Open. I've got a shortcut to it here. If I save my change, we see the little paperclip. The paperclip, just to reiterate, doesn't mean a PDF attachment. It just means at least one file attachment linked to this record, in this case a Word document. And if I did have a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet that I wanted to preview, I would have to have that application on my computer to be able to open the attachment. It's only PDFs that you can preview directly in EndNote itself. So that, again, that was a quick way to manually attach really any type of file, almost any type of file to your library record. And just to reiterate, you know, each library record can store up to 45 attachments if need be. Most users are probably only attaching 1 or 2 files, but it's nice to know you have that flexibility. I wanted to show another quick feature called Find Full Text that I had referenced earlier when we were covering our learning objectives. It's another feature built into EndNote itself that it can allow EndNote to go out onto the web to try to find full text articles to download automatically. Just to show you quickly how you can customize this feature further to include some institution-specific resources. In EndNote 20 on Windows, if you go to the Edit drop-down and choose Preferences, you've got a tab here on the left called Find Full Text. And if you go here, there are a couple of, you know, open access resources that everyone will be able to query. I don't have any specialized article access here, so my example will really be of someone who's only got, you know, open access available to me. But if you were at an organization that has an open URL server, you would be given something that looks like a web address to type into the open URL path field. That can help expand what EndNote can connect to when performing a Find Full Text search, possibly improve your success rate. In addition to that, there's also the Authenticate with URL field. This is more primarily used by larger institutions like universities. There's a couple of examples what this authentication address would look like. With something in this field, once per Find Full Text session, EndNote would open a browser in the EndNote application, taking you to that page so that you can input your institutional login credentials. And again, during that session of Find Full Text searching, EndNote may be able to access subscription resources as well and overall improve your success rate. Again, I don't have any specialized article access, so I don't have anything to type in here, but I wanted to point that out. When you're ready to perform a Find Full Text search, you would just highlight the references you wanted to query on. You can do this on a reference by reference basis, or you can highlight, you know, a batch of references at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and just in my parents group, I'm going to highlight maybe about a dozen or so articles here, and I've just done so by clicking the first reference and then holding Shift as I click the last in the range. We see the entire range become highlighted. Whenever I'm ready, I could click this shortcut right here on the library window, or I can go to References, Find Full Text, and initiate it from here. I'll go ahead and use the menu item today. And I'm going to collapse my groups because, again, we're performing a Find Full Text search, and collapsing the groups makes it a little bit easier to see this section. And we see that EndNote's going through one at a time. It's checking each article to see if a PDF can be found. And in my case, it's really just open access articles. There are 3 possible outcomes. It looks like we've got examples of all 3 so far. I want to let this finish before we start looking through them. But again, for me, it's looking for open access articles, and that will the overall number of open access articles that you'll find really depends on, the publication date range for your references and your field of study. From what I understand, probably expect between 25 and 40% of articles recently published to be published in an open access format. So out of the 13 references, EndNote was able to find 5 PDFs and just downloaded those for me automatically. We see those attached to these library references. EndNote did that for me automatically. For one, EndNote couldn't find the PDF, but it found a URL, and if I go to the Edit tab and scroll down to the URL field, I would see the URL. I guess I could have seen it on summary, but this is where it's actually stored in the reference. Usually this links to the publisher's website where you would typically have the option to purchase or rent the article. Now, if you're affiliated with a university or an employer that subscribes to full text articles, if something comes up as found URL in EndNote, I wouldn't necessarily just go out and purchase the article. There's a chance you might have access to it through a different service or system through your institution. So if you're at a university, reach out to the university librarian. You might have access to the article for free through interlibrary loan. And if you're affiliated with another organization that has a library, feel free to reach out to them. If you're at an organization that doesn't have a library, someone in your IT department might be able to help identify whether or not you would have, free access to a particular article through a subscription that your, in that case, employer subscribes to. So I did want to point that out. So that was a quick overview. Oh, excuse me, and the last outcome as sort of described here is not found. So for 7 of my 13, EndNote wasn't able to find any article or URL to download. So that was a quick overview of the Find Full Text Search. The last sort of file attachment element that I wanted to touch on today is how EndNote can import PDFs from your hard drive. Like I mentioned, you can import PDFs one at a time, or you can import a folder of PDFs if you've got an entire folder. Either way, whether you want to import a single PDF or a folder, you would start the process by going to the File dropdown. About halfway down, we've got the menu item for import. And if you were importing a single PDF or a single text file, you would choose the File submenu item. If it's a folder of PDFs, that's when you would choose Folder. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to import a folder. I've got Import Folder up. I'm going to press Choose to select my folder. I know that this is in Downloads, so I'm just navigating to my Downloads folder. And here we have, let's see here. Oh, here it is, Project Articles, that's the one. And you'll notice that I've got a couple of subfolders, and I want to make sure that EndNote looks for PDFs in the subfolders as well. So I'm going to select the overarching folder, press OK. I'm going to mark these 2 optional settings. I'm going to ask EndNote to look at files and subfolders for this import, and I also want EndNote to make a group set for me based off of that folder structure. When you're importing PDFs, the import option is always set to PDF. When you're importing PDFs, duplicates doesn't really matter, because if EndNote finds you're importing a PDF for a reference that already exists, EndNote will just attach the PDF to the existing reference instead of duplicating it. But this duplicate setting would come into play more if you're importing references from a consistently tagged text file. So I did want to point that out. I'm going to go ahead and press Import. Now, EndNote is going through one PDF at a time, looking at the first 2 pages of text and the metadata of each PDF to try to find the article's DOI number. And if that DOI number is found, EndNote will automatically query a partner database called Crossref. And as long as Crossref indexes the reference metadata, EndNote will automatically populate a reference in my library and attach the PDF at the same time. So we see that EndNote's just created the group structure for me, the group set structure. The import just finished as I was speaking. We had 9 PDFs imported overall. For the majority of them, we see that EndNote, created a reference for me. We see all of the reference information. We see the PDF attached as well. For a couple of these, we see really just placeholder records where we've got the PDF attached, but in terms of reference metadata, all it is the title of the PDF in the title field. These are examples of PDFs where EndNote wasn't able to find a DOI number. And for these, again, EndNote can't populate a reference. You could, if you wanted to, you could try to, go between the PDF itself and copy and paste the information into the appropriate fields, but it might actually be easier just to delete these placeholder records and maybe try to find these through a service like Google Scholar or another online database, and then, manually attach the PDFs. That might be a little bit quicker than just, manually populating those placeholder records. So with all this said, we're ready to switch over to Cite While You Write and sort of give what I mentioned, an overview of the daily driver functionality now that we have some references in the library for this particular project that I wanted to work on today. So like I mentioned, when you install EndNote 20, EndNote will scan your hard drive for compatible versions of Microsoft Office, and if one is found, EndNote will automatically load the what we call the Cite While You Write add-in for Microsoft Word. I've already got a real basic Word document open. I'm going to leave my library up here. I'm going to switch over to Word, where, again, real basic body of text. We see on my ribbon, which is what Microsoft calls a series of tabs that run across the top of the document window. I've got a tab for EndNote 20. These are the EndNote 20 Cite While You Write commands. And again, I'm not going to go over everything today, but we're going to look at a couple of options to cite references, an option to change your output styles, and an option to edit your in-text citations. So when you want to add a citation to your text, regardless of the method that you use, you're going to start by positioning your cursor where you want to create that citation. So let's pretend that at the end of this first sample sentence, this is where I want to add a citation. I've got my cursor in position. I'm going to go ahead and click on the little magnifying glass shortcut here on the left side of the EndNote tab. This is a shortcut for the command insert citation. And I want to make sure I'm going to search my libraries here. This is something you probably won't have to do, but because I reset my preferences, this is one extra click that I have to perform. But I want to search my active local library, the library that I currently have open. If you did have more than one library open at the same time, EndNote would look through all of the libraries for matching references. From the search field, I want to input an author name, a keyword, a publication year, part of a title, any bit of information that would be found in a reference that I wanted to cite. I could input it here. Let's just stick with that project that I was gathering references for pertaining to sushi, the food. I've got just the keyword sushi in there. I've got the year 2020. If I press find, EndNote will show me all references in which this information is found in the library reference. So we see in my active library, I've got 56 references that match the scope of the search. If I did have more than one library open, the library label would let me know which specific library a given search result was found in. We see that, if I click on a reference, I can look at all of the underlying information. This can be handy if you have ambiguous matches to make sure you're selecting the correct match. I did just want to point out before we select one here that when you input information into the search field, that EndNote's not looking in any particular field for this information. So just as an example for this reference from the first author with the surname Castrica, I had searched for the term sushi and 2020. So we see that 2020 was not found in the year field. It's definitely found somewhere in the reference. But I just wanted to point out, if you search for just a surname, EndNote's not looking just in the author field. It's going to look in any one of the fields to try to find that reference. And if you input something like the year, a year, EndNote's not just looking in the year field. In this example, it looks like it's actually found in the abstract. So I just wanted to point that out. If I go ahead and, let's say this is the reference I want to cite, I can go ahead and highlight it and press insert. Right where my cursor is flashing, we see my in-text citation get created. And at the end of my text, because I have a feature called instant formatting turned on, we see the start of my bibliography. And as I continue to develop my text and cite references, EndNote will continue to update the bibliography itself. Now, I'm formatting with that default annotated style, which again is just a generic author date style. It would include the abstract information when available, kind of an uncommon format. If I wanted to apply a different style on the fly, I can click the style drop down here. Maybe I want to choose Vancouver, let's say. That's a numbered style. If I click on that, as soon as I choose my new style, again, because instant formatting is enabled by default, my in-text citation updated, again, to be a numbered format, and my reference list updated, the entry in the reference list updated as well. So you can change styles on the fly. This is great if you're not sure who might be interested in publishing your research. You can format your references according to one journal's formatting guidelines, turn around, choose another style, and you can submit to them as well without having to redo all of your references by hand. Another method of reference insertion involves switching back to your library to highlight the references you want to insert. So this next method that we call insert selected citation, you would still begin by positioning your cursor where you want to add an in-text citation. Let's pretend at the end of this sentence here. And if I now switch back to EndNote, I'm going to click Go to EndNote. I can highlight one or more references in my library to create a citation out of them. So if I have a nice organized library with different group sets for different projects, I might just click on a particular group for that project to help streamline this this process. And all I need to do, again, is highlight the references I want to insert. So maybe I want to make a group citation out of 3 references. I can just click on one reference here. I've got one highlighted. If I hold down Control, I can click another reference, and you see I have 2 highlighted. And maybe just as an example, I'll select one more reference here, hold down Control. I now have 3 references highlighted. Whenever I'm ready, I can insert these into my document a couple of different ways. But if I go to the Tools drop-down, we see I have a menu item called Cite While You Write. And here I could trigger insert selected citation. There's also, if you note, the keyboard shortcut of Alt and the number 2 key. If I, instead of going to the menu item, if I just highlight one or more references and press Alt 2, that would trigger the command as well. But since I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and click the menu item. Right where my cursor is flashing, we see my new grouped citation because I had more than one reference selected, and we see that my bibliography updated as well. So that's a couple of methods. Those are the 2 primary methods of citation insertion. If you prefer to stay in Word and search your libraries for references to cite, you can do so with the Insert Citation shortcut here. But if you've got a curated library organized for different projects, it might actually be quicker to just switch back to your library and highlight the references you want to cite from the library window itself, in which case insert selected citation would let you do that. Now, the output style really dictates how your citations and bibliography will appear, but there are some settings that are document specific related to the bibliography that you would define in Word itself. So if I wanted to change the line spacing or the font of my bibliography, or I want to add a bibliography title, I wouldn't want to achieve that just by using Word itself to make the change, because the EndNote elements in your document contain hidden codes behind them. And if I make a change using Word like I just did, I made a double-spaced bibliography, because that change didn't update those underlying codes, the next time EndNote formats the document, the change gets lost. So if I want to make a permanent change to my bibliography like that, I would click this little button on my EndNote 20 tab. It's a shortcut for Configure Bibliography. If I press that here, I get taken to a Configure Bibliography window where I can do things like change my style. Maybe I'll format with APA 7th instead. I can make my citations clickable hyperlinks if I was submitting in a digital format and my reader was going to be reading the article or project electronically. I can make my citations clickable hyperlinks that would take my reader to the reference in the bibliography if they were to click the citation. I'm going to leave that turned off. It's a pretty uncommon requirement, but nice to know you can do it. If I go to the Layout tab, this is where I can change things like my font. I can change the size of the bibliography. I can add a bibliography title, and if I highlight that title with my mouse, I can go to text format. I can add a font attribute like bolding just to the title. If I was using a numbered style like Vancouver, I could start my bibliography with a number other than 1 if I wanted to. I can control the first line indent and hanging indent from this window as well. I can change my my line spacing. I got single, 1.5, or double spaced. I'm going to keep a single spaced reference list, but I'm going to increase the readability of the bibliography by adding a single space or a single blank line after each reference. And now that I've got this configured, if I press OK, all right, we see all of those changes take effect. I've got my APA 7th citations. It's an author date format. I've got my font and size change for my bibliography. I see my bibliography title. I see my space after each reference, and I see the general APA 7th guidelines applied here. So again, your output style that you select will dictate most of how the bibliography formats, but if you go to Configure Bibliography, there are some document-specific settings that you might have to configure at least once per writing project. Once you've configured that, EndNote will continue formatting with those settings in place, but if you were to start a new writing project in a new document, you might have to change those settings one more time. Now, just quickly here, if I wanted to customize the appearance of one of my in-text citations, I can do so. Again, I wouldn't want to do that by manually changing what I see because that would not update the underlying code behind the citation. I would start this process by highlighting the citation I want to customize. If it's a grouped citation, I would highlight the entire group. I can then go to Edit and Manage Citations. And on this window, we see that this top half shows all of the citations in the text, but whichever one you select will be in focus automatically. Now, since this is a grouped citation, I might still need to select the appropriate reference in the group, but it's in focus automatically. Let's stick on the Adams reference. Let's say that I want to suppress the author's name because I mentioned it in the preceding sentence. That's something that's sometimes required so that you're not duplicating that information. And then let's say I want to so let's actually suppress the author name first. If I go to the formatting drop-down here on the bottom half of this window, I would choose exclude author in that scenario. Let's say I want to add a phrase at the beginning of the parenthetical citation, maybe the phrase see also. I add that as a prefix here. That's just text that would appear at the beginning of the parenthetical citation. Suffix is really the same concept. It would just be trailing text at the end of the parenthetical citation. The pages field is unique to certain styles that are set up to include cited page information. I can tell you that both APA 6th and APA 7th are set up to do so. Not every style is set up to use this pages field. So for certain styles, if you type something in here, nothing will show up in the formatted citation. You can always force page numbers to appear by inputting it here in suffix, but if you've got a style set up for pages, cited pages, you can just type in a page number or a range of pages here in the pages field, and if you press OK, you'll see all of those changes take effect. And those changes can be applied on a citation-by-citation basis, which is really handy because in some cases, if you are required to add cited page information, you might cite the same reference 5 times, perhaps, and each citation might refer to a different page in that source work. So having that flexibility is important. The last element that I wanted to touch on today was how you would remove a citation that you might no longer want to have in note format. So different reasons why you might need to do this. If you inserted something by mistake, or again, maybe the scope of your body of text has changed as such, where you no longer need to reference a particular source work, you wouldn't want to just delete what you see because that might still leave some of that hidden code behind. So if you want to remove a citation, just highlight it with your mouse again. Go back to Edit and Manage Citations. On this window here, we see that that citation is in focus. If I want to take this one out, click the down arrow on the right side of its line, choose Remove Citation. It's going to come off this window. If I click OK, it's going to come out of the text. And if that was the only time the reference was cited in the document, it will also come out of the bibliography. So I just like to point that out. In some cases, you might manually delete a citation and it might seem like it works, but again, you might leave some of that underlying code behind, and that can cause formatting issues down the road and lead to error messages and things like that.